Hello! Today I would like to tell you the story of a military man who is called the Ukrainian Remarque. I also invite you to write in the comments what similar stories you know. The most interesting story will be included in the next video, and we will be able to share it together. Now, let's get back to the story of the Ukrainian Remarque. 26-year-old Oleksandr Budko from Rivne had big plans for 2022. He was going to become a graphic designer and was working his last shift as a barista in one of the establishments in Kiev's Podol district. But on the morning of February 24th, everything changed, and instead of going to work, Oleksandr started looking for a way to volunteer for the front. He didn't go to the military registration and enlistment office. There were queues, and it was not a given that he would be accepted due to his health condition. "I had problems with my legs," he explains, smiling. There is a bitter irony in these words. Exactly 6 months later, on August 24th, Oleksandr, already a platoon commander of the 49th Separate Carpathian Siege Rifle Battalion, call sign Teren, would lose both of his legs during the Kharkiv counteroffensive. The soldier writes about his military everyday life and his injuries in an unvarnished manner in his Instagram diary, which is read by more than 23,000 people. Some of them call him the Ukrainian Remarque, others call him Kurt Vonnegut, who could tell the most tragic stories with humor, and Oleksandr likes his countryman Ulas Samchuk. Now the military man has a new plan. He is writing a book, adapting to life on his new iron legs. The title of his future military autobiography is The Story of a Stubborn Man. Oleksandr says that this successfully describes his way to the front line. Before the war, he had never held a weapon, but he had a great desire to get into the thick of things. As the soldier explains, he did not want the sacrifices of those who gave their lives for Ukraine, starting with the wars of the Cossack era, to be in vain. "It was a driving force that originated in me long ago," says Oleksandr. But everything turned out to be not so simple. At first, he joined one of the nationalist organizations with which he went shooting for a month and a half and studied tactical medicine. He was preparing to become an assault pilot, but got tired of waiting for a chance to prove himself. While the battle for Kiev was going on, his service was limited to guarding a building with important data for the state, the soldier says. In April, the guys were told that they had a combat mission. Quote, "There were explosions, tanks, special forces, and we were like, this is great. But then they said that we were an evacuation group and that our attempts to get into the assault group were useless. I was upset, and then this task was canceled as well. Soon, the volunteers decided to leave and find themselves in other units. Oleksandr ended up in the Carpathian Sich, where a month later, he was appointed commander of a fire support platoon of the 2nd Company. But there were obstacles even here. When the battalion was sent to the Izium area in May, the car where Oleksandr was supposed to sit broke down. We had to either change the car or stay in Kiev for an unknown period of time. It was my 5th or 6th attempt to get to the front, and I said to myself, no, this is a bit of a surreal story. I have to go," the soldier recalls. Eventually, part of the group was loaded into a cargo van. There was room for everyone except Oleksandr and 2 other guys. He was beginning to give up when the commander came and said that he was going to the front in his car and that he could join him. Oleksandr was happy. He admits it was like a holiday for him. He liked being in the army. In his volunteer battalion, he says, there were no lineups at 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening, no strict reporting, and commanders were often addressed on a first-name basis. In addition, a week after arriving in the Kharkiv region on May 19th, they slowly began to advance. Oleksandr remembers the day of his injury, August 24, in detail. He recalls waking up at 3 in the morning. The whole village was covered in blue and yellow ribbons and flags. It was impressive. Late in the evening, when the soldiers were returning from their positions, none of this was there yet. The locals had worked hard to make a holiday for themselves and the military. The soldiers took their rations and came to the neighboring village to their mortar positions. Our men had already entered several nearby positions, took them back, and took several prisoners. A tank started firing at the landing, and we could not reach it with the mortar. It was more than 7 kilometers away, and the command ordered us to wait for new coordinates and targets," says Oleksandr. The day was hot, and the guys decided to take a break for lunch. They were always tired. They went to bed at 10 or 11 in the evening and got up at 3 or 4, the soldier says. So, after having lunch, they decided to take a nap. The soldiers laid down under a sprawling walnut tree, behind which they could not see their positions, and Oleksandr decided that it was safer to stay in the trench. After getting comfortable, he took off his armor. He says that the village had never been hit before, and it even surprised the military, but Alexander never thought he would be killed or injured. Quote, "And I started to fall asleep when at one point, no one heard a whistle or an exit. I felt a terrible pain in my legs, and the ground shifted on me. I started screaming. My comrades were alive. They dug me up, quickly put a tourniquet on me, and called for evacuation." The soldier says he immediately realized that such severe pain did not bode well. Even before arriving at the front, he had come up with the idea of writing his blood type not only on his chevron, but also on his pants and boots. And when he was being carried on a stretcher, he comforted himself with the thought that even though he was not wearing a chevron vest, the inscriptions on his boots should have survived. In his diary, he recalls looking up to make sure and seeing that there was little left of his boots. His feet were still there, Alexander says, but they had nothing to hold on to. The soldier says that he is most offended that all this happened during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and he wanted to reach at least Izium. In the neighboring village of Barvinkove, Alexander underwent his first amputation. Then he was taken to a hospital in Kharkiv, then to Poltava. "Because I was in Kharkiv for several days without surgery, tissue began to die off, and the doctor said that my left leg should also be elevated," he says. Alexander speaks of inadequate medical care. "I was there in Poltava, and I started to actually rot, and the doctors did not want to let me go to Kiev or home to Rivne to the hospital, no matter how much I asked. Eventually, through my friend's volunteer connections, I was admitted to the central hospital in Kiev, and there I underwent 2 more amputations," the soldier says. He began to fear that at this rate he might lose his knee, but it was not to be. His parents didn't know about the amputations. The soldier wanted to tell them after all the surgeries, so as not to upset them once again. He almost missed it. They learned about the news from social media, where Alexander's friend announced a fundraiser for medical expenses. Quote, "Of course, there were tears in my eyes, but I set them in a different mood. I immediately put everything in its place, that I can take care of myself, that I don't need to bring diapers, wipe my mouth." Alexander began to realize that he would have to live in a new way only when he got into a wheelchair and started moving around the streets. In Kiev, it was not so difficult, but in Rivne and Lviv, where there are a lot of cobblestones, it is almost impossible to use a wheelchair, the soldier says. He also noticed that people often look down when they see amputations. Lviv-based photographer Marta Serko also noticed this. She recalled how in museums, people stand in long lines to look at beautiful ancient Roman statues, although many of them also lack arms, legs, or noses. This contrast surprised her, and she invited Alexander to a photo shoot to show people living monuments, the closest witnesses of the war, which she believed should be admired in the same way. He agreed to inspire his fellow soldiers not to be shy either. Quote, "And as I heard, some guys agreed to a photo shoot after my photos, and people are slowly overestimating the situation that is and will be in our country prostheses and getting to know America." 3 months after his injury, Alexander was fitted with prostheses. In Ukraine, good prostheses are made for the military free of charge. If it is a case of losing an arm or a hip, the best technologies are abroad, he says. He was fitted with perfect prostheses, but Alexander also applied to the Revived Soldiers Ukraine Foundation, which has been helping to provide prosthetics to Ukrainian soldiers since 2014, and a few months later, he got to the United States. There, he was fitted with special sports prostheses, some for running and others for CrossFit, because the soldier was actively involved in sports before the war, and now he wants to start running professionally. Prostheses can be changed depending on the task. That's why now I have 6 legs. I look like a spider, Alexander laughs. Learning to run on prostheses is difficult, but he is motivated. In July, Dusseldorf will host the Invictus Games, where military, rescue, and law enforcement personnel who were injured in the war compete. In Miami, Alexander realized another dream of his. He saw the ocean and made sure he could swim without prostheses. It was the first time since his injury. "I was laughing and enjoying myself like a child. I was no longer afraid of sharks. They usually bite off my legs," he wrote in his diary. The soldier says Americans are not surprised by steel limbs. His prosthetic center was full of people, adults, teenagers, and very young children. Quote, "Sometimes you walk down the street and children may pay attention and ask their parents something, but in general, society does not react so noticeably, perhaps because it was common there before and now it is considered normal. And we still have some remnants of the Soviet Union where there were no disabled people because they were not seen. Quote, I am grateful to my legs for walking so much. Hundreds of people in Ukraine have already gotten back on their feet of steel. At the Superhumans Prosthetic Center, which will open in a few weeks in the Lviv region, they estimate that about 5,000 Ukrainians will need prostheses based on statistics from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Alexander is living a full life with his new legs. He says he still has phantom pains. Quote, yesterday, my fingers felt like there was a current running through them, but he is moving forward and has a lot of plans. The soldier says he feels like an idea generator, and he is no longer interested in graphic design. Now he is studying online to become an art manager and is taking classes at a school of journalism. He was invited there after noticing a diary that Alexander started on Instagram a few days before he arrived at the front line. There, he talks about his comrades, frontline stories, and his injuries. Quote, I wrote primarily for myself, but I wanted others to read about those who are fighting for us, and that they are not really cyborgs, but ordinary people like you and me. Now, his teachers at the School of Journalism, such famous writers as Yuri Andrukovich, Oksana Zabushko, Lyubko Deresh, and others, teach him to write better, to think over the plot and characters. The soldier hopes that this will have a favorable effect on his book. He also plans to work for Superhumans to help with the rehabilitation of his fellow soldiers. But for now, Alexander notes, he is still a Carpathian Sich fighter, and he has a military medical commission ahead of him that may dismiss him or recognize him as partially fit for service at the headquarters or other authorities. The soldier admits that he does not know what he wants more. Quote, I plan to go somewhere to the front, talk to the military, raise morale, and maybe even work a little, and then I will make the final decision, whether to associate myself with the military or to help wounded soldiers, civilians, and develop inclusion in Ukraine. He looks back on his past life without nostalgia, rather with gratitude, says 26-year-old Alexander Budko. I'm grateful to my legs for walking so much, for going so many places, for seeing so much. I think it gave me the impetus, understanding, and skills that I can use now, standing on prostheses. Don't miss the chances that are under your feet or even in your legs. The soldier advises thousands of his readers. That's the story, dear friends. Let us know in the comments if you liked it and what you think about such stories. Also, don't forget that if you have a similar story, you can write about it in the comments, and then I will be able to make and distribute a video about your story so that as many people as possible can learn about the heroism and sacrifices of the military, defending freedom and standing up for their country.